wanted to talk to you for a little while, for very obvious reasons. You are engaged actively in the field. You also believe you're a producer for the Cliff and Bobo podcast as well, and all 10 of your fingers seem to be stuck deep into that Bigfoot pie. So, I just like to get deep into what you're doing in the field at the moment, what your theories and ideas are about the genre, and, the perils and pitfalls of what makes up modern Bigfooting. So let's just start at the beginning. What dragged you into this world, this big, crazy, multicolored rainbow of assorted Bigfoot philosophies and theories?
Certainly. Well, like many people, I had an experience that occurred when I was younger, and it was not a visual experience, so we didn't see these things. But in short, like myself and four other friends, I grew up in southern Appalachia in the mountains in northeast Georgia, and some friends and I were intending to camp and had set up a camp, and were essentially doing a night hike, and had a very frightening experience with at least two unseen things that didn't behave like conventional animals that I knew about behaved, bear, deer, etc., animals that you'd encounter in southern Appalachia, and they didn't seem to be people. So it was frightening and harrowing, and we ended up not camping. We ran back down to our vehicles and drove back to my mom's house. I was 17 at the time, so still obviously, and came back for all our stuff the next day. And it was such an odd experience. I didn't really have like a perceptual framework or that sort of understanding that people even claim to see such animals in other parts of the country. I had a peripheral awareness of the idea of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but at that time, this was 1999, and I was a teenager, so it was probably still predicated on this idea of like a singular individual, like Frankenstein or Dracula or something like that, this one individual Bigfoot that people claim to see in the Northwest, because I just never devoted any time or thought to it. I probably I know I saw Harry and the Hendersons when I was a kid, and that was about it, so I didn't really have a strong understanding of what had occurred, and it was so compelling. Like, friends and I would go back to this specific place at night, hoping that these things would happen again, and they never did. And it was about 2 years later that I stumbled on Sasquatch information online, just searching, all sorts of like odd things or esoterica, etc. And I definitely, I've told this story a million times, but I remember laughing as I read Bigfoot stuff because it seems so silly and preposterous, the idea of these big hairy apes, kicking over people's trash cans and throwing rocks at them and scaring them and, ha ha ha. And was reading like certain testimonies that had the same sort of environmental context that we were in, where these things were displaying the same behaviors that we had experienced, which was pretty compelling. And then moreover, a friend of mine that night had a VHS-C camcorder. And so a lot of the sounds we heard were recorded. And then hearing purported vocalization recordings and wood knock recordings, things of that nature. I mean, we heard those same things. And so being able to have like an A/B comparison between what we'd heard and recorded and these purported Sasquatch sounds, really like, oh man, maybe there's actually something to this. And it wasn't as easy to dismiss. So it's like the hook started to be set. But again, being in North Georgia, at that time, there was a handful of books on the subject that you could get access to, some of the bigger publications like Krantz and Green and Sanderson, et cetera. None of those really focused on Southern Appalachia. There were no regional groups or organizations or collections of individual. And in fact, I don't even think that there were many individual researchers that had any sort of like an online presence. Because by the time I really started looking into it, would have been like late 2001, early 2002.
Okay.
It was still kind of the early days of the internet, but certainly there was next to nothing about the Sasquatch on the internet beyond like the BFRO's website or, a couple of other of those, if you remember the old school, like Angel Fire and GeoCities, terrible sites with like, dark green backgrounds and hot pink text and just god awful to read,
Some of those are still around, sort of floating out there on the internet.
Yeah, some of them still are. And so, trying to look into those, but still not finding a lot of those connections to make. I was kind of on my own for a number of years. And the other thing that really set the hook is, in trying to think through the problem of like, okay, well, if these are real animals, they must have always been here. They can't be recent introductions into the region or something of that nature. And so the first sort of layer of research that I was doing, beyond trying to find other local witnesses, people who thought they'd seen these things or encountered tracks or heard sounds, I was digging into newspaper archives and other sort of like historical repositories. And in short order, I found, just from this little corner of northeastern Georgia where I grew up, I found about 37 newspaper articles that predated the year 1900 that described people, detailing people's claims of seeing animals that fit this description pre-1900.
Wow.
And so to find so many in such a short time in North Georgia, it was like, that really set the hook of like, wow, this is not a modern invention. It's not just the product of the television or the radio or the internet for that matter. It does have a history. And it's just that no one had ever mined those repositories and tried to put those together and disseminate them the way that J.W. Burns had in British Columbia, and then later John Green had, and because those researchers,
I guess they were in the wrong location as well, as far as most researchers were concerned.
Well, certainly. Well, there's, a longer history in the East, the eastern, part of North America, and it makes sense because it was, the printed word came to the East first, and it was settled first before, it spread across the country. Obviously, indigenous, oral traditions, folklore, artistic representations go back much farther, but because, those languages weren't externalized in a written form, it's hard to track that history until the written word is employed in North America. But so the indigenous representations are much older, but we just don't know how far back those go because they're not written. We can date artistic representations like the stone head carvings from the Columbia River and various masks and totems, etc., that we like interpret or associate with the Sasquatch phenomenon. But finding that amount of historical information in the area where my experience occurred was pretty powerful. And then meeting other local witnesses, that was probably like the big, I think everyone who pursues this, I'm sure you've experienced it. At some point you have like a transformative experience.
Yeah.
And something occurs where it's just like, I can't stop thinking about this. Like, this problem really matters and I want to investigate it. And I think it was the combination of those things, seeing that there was a legitimate history that no one else had really aggregated or put together yet, and then meeting other people locally who had seen these things or claimed to see these things, let's say. It was, and so I haven't stopped thinking about it for like 20 years. So here we are.
Well, I mean, I can definitely relate to that experience. I've never actually literally had any experience that I would call a cryptid experience in my life, but similarly to yourself, it's just the collection of sightings and encounters that are normally, I suppose, separated by class, by profession, by location, and especially when you have these antagonistic witnesses, people who have no interest in the subject, but they can't unsee what they have seen. And regardless of what happens to them in their career or in their life or in their personal relationships, they can't turn around and say, no, it didn't happen, I was mistaken. And that's one of the things that's always compelled me and drawn me towards this. Now, I'm very curious about your experience, actually. Was it the classic stones throwing, wood pops, wood knocks, noises, and intimidation? Do you feel that you were being pushed out of the area that you were in intentionally?
I do, if I had to interpret motive or something of that nature, that's what it felt like at the time. So essentially, we first heard the sounds of like two large things that seemed to be paralleling us or following us, stalking us, however you'd like to define it. And it was at night. And so this was during the summertime, eastern deciduous forest. So, very near jungle thick and a lot of insect noise and things of that nature. So we had flashlights, these little mag lights. But if you shine them into the brush, you just saw a wall of green brush. And so as we're going up this night hike, essentially we had heard about what was supposed to be an abandoned cabin on the side of this mountain that had its own sort of history of spooky stories associated with. So we had set up a camp at the base of this mountain. We're going to hike up and try to find this abandoned cabin and see what it was about. We're teenage kids,
Yeah.
And so hearing these large things moving. Of course, at first we thought it was animals, and we'd stop, but then there were these other odd sounds. Like I definitely remember, and it was captured on this recording too, the sound of like a branch being broken and ripped, sounding like it was ripped from a tree. Bam, bam, bam. And then one of my friends on the tape says, sounds like wood being slammed together. Of course, this was 1999. We didn't know anything. There was no finding Bigfoot or mysterious encounters. Like we'd never heard of that concept. And so some of those behaviors seemed, well, that's not a bear and it's not a deer. And so we were so scared. And of course, we're kids, like I think one or two of us might have had a pocket knife, like we were just too young to have, we couldn't buy alcohol. And so nobody was drinking anything of that, and all sober minded. But in our fear, we're yelling at what we think might be people, because we turn off the flashlights and it was total darkness and you could hear these things moving around, but you didn't see any light coming through the trees. So it was like, if these are people, they don't have flashlights, they're maneuvering in the dark. And so we were yelling things like, we're armed, we're going to shoot you. What are you doing here? And of course, no responses, but we did hear whoop sounds and like bellowing, moaning howl sounds, and then a massive tree get pushed over. And so it was just bizarre and frightening.
That's a really severe intimidation, really, essentially. That would have been, that would have sold me for sure. But similarly, I'm not sure, like yourself, if I would have been aware at that time that all of those attributes were associated with Bigfoot. And that's an interesting thing. Well, exactly. And I think that almost gives more validation to that kind of experience. Like, you've clearly been engaged for 20 years since in the search for Bigfoot. Like I said, you went back to the area, never found anything. Have you ever had any experiences that were more bona fide than that since?
I've had a lot of those sort of sound only experiences, and two experiences had a visual element, but I wouldn't call those sightings, because in both instances, one was in 2007 in central North Carolina and one was in 2012 in northwestern Arkansas. The first one was at night and it was essentially a silhouette. It was in the dark. And the second one was at night, but it was a portion of an animal through a thermal imager. So I wouldn't call either of those sightings, because I spent the entire time like, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? Trying to fight confirmation bias and wishful thinking, because I'm like, please let it be a Sasquatch.
Yeah.
So I still haven't seen one, despite all these years. I would really love to have that experience. Obviously, I'm convinced that they do exist. I've had a number of experiences that involved rock throwing or hearing projectiles, experiencing projectiles, finding tracks or impressions, or, that are consistent with those that are associated with the Sasquatch phenomenon. I've heard vocalizations a number of times, because I've been just so heavily involved in the field for, I started doing field research in about 2002, interviewing witnesses, but I didn't get really serious until about 2004. And then by 2007, I was traveling around the country all the time for it, and still do. So it is frustrating to not have that visual confirmation. I definitely want to have that. I envy the people that have that sort of certainty of what they've seen, because
I envy them in one sense, Matt, and in another sense, I worry about having that confirmation. Guy looking for Bigfoot sees Bigfoot and therefore believes he's real, and then suddenly it's almost like you've got too much skin in the game to be objective about the evidence, and that's something I worry about. I want the experience, preferably from a distance to begin with, not too up close. But at the same time, it feels to me as if those people that I know who had it can't see what they've seen and etc. and are entirely sure, are almost excluded or excluded by the skeptics. Well, you're a believer, etc., etc. How can we trust your objective point of view? What could possibly be out there, scientifically speaking? What are your feelings on that? How do we assess the evidence and the witnesses, especially the anecdotal evidence, and put it in some sort of scientific framework that can be shown to people, and that can convince them of the reality of this species?
Certainly. Well, it's such a difficult proposition, because obviously I am motivated by the testimonial claims. Now, I'm hyper focused on evidence and the analyses of physical evidence too, but claims are very motivating, and they do sort of form the bedrock. I mean, the whole phenomenon is really made up of those two components, you know, testimonial claims and then physical items, elements, whatever you want to call them, that are touted or interpreted as evidence to support the claims. And so trying to contextualize those in a scientific manner, especially when it comes to claims, is very difficult because, you know, humans are really limited detection tools. You know, we've got a host of limitations and interpretive schemas that vary wildly across a population. Even if you're looking into a certain area or a certain region, it's not like everyone in Southern Appalachia has the same interpretive schema, you know, that they would experience something and interpret it as a biological animal versus, you know, certain parts of the country where like spirituality is so much more like higher on the hierarchy of values, and therefore everything's interpreted through that particular schema. And so, you know, people have these interpretations. And so it's easy, I think, for people with, like, I have always thankfully maintained like a very biologically grounded perspective, ecologically grounded perspective. So maybe in the early days, I might have been dismissive of certain claims because they were associated with the supernatural, the paranormal, physical. But then, you know, understanding over time that, you know, many people interpret the natural world through a supernatural lens. And so if describing something in that language, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're lying or misrepresenting something. It's just that's the language that it's couched in. And I think humans have shared that relationship with animals. I mean, we've shared that relationship with natural phenomena, certainly the environment as such. But, you know, if you were to look into, you know, I've spent a lot of time, I've been working on this book project that I hope will get done this year, but I said that in 2020 and I said that in 2021 too. So we'll see if I can get it done this year. But, you know, you have this history of supernatural attributes that are projected onto the Sasquatch. And there's a through line through indigenous cultures, through early European settlers, and to modern people. I mean, you still have people that sort of think in this way about these beings, creatures, animals, whatever category you want to put them in. But very often they're the same exact supernatural attributes that people have historically associated with other large charismatic megafauna that are rare and intimidating. So you see it with tigers, and you see it with bears, and you see it with gorillas, and sort of like the pre-Western scientific history of those animals. And so it's like, well, on one hand, there is this sort of like scientific dismissal of claims because they do very often have that sort of bent. But then you could look at the history of these other animals that have the same attributes and say, well, if the Sasquatch exists, you should expect people to have these particular supernatural interpretations, their behavior, their appearance, their place in the environment, our place in the context with them. And here are the specific ones you should expect by looking at the histories of these other, again, like large, rare, intimidating animals. And they all line up completely.
It's definitely demonstrable in other cultures, and even our own culture and our near past, that we've done that with, I should say, with large megafauna. That's something that's interested me for a long time, especially when you look into British and European history of things like the woodwows or dragons, even that are large, relatively speaking, usually large lizards or serpents of some kind, winged or otherwise. And you see the way that they're drawn or redrawn by the artists of the day. And there's a fox-like head and a giraffe-like neck and bat-like wings and a snake-like body. And you think this artist is utilizing known animals from his or her mental library. And that's the same with witnesses. Often when they describe something, they have to reach into their mental library to pluck out details that could possibly match what they've seen. But what you normally get is a bit of a patchwork quilt of a creature because it's something that they haven't known before. And I was reminded of that when I was speaking, when I was thinking of the Aztecs seeing Cortez ships sailing towards them and imagining them or seeing them as floating mountains because they had nothing, but they were sort of tall and pointed, and that's the closest thing in their mental library that would match what they were looking at. I wonder with the animals that we describe or witnesses have described, especially in the past, and even today, somehow, like you say, through people's own philosophical or spiritual lens, depending on culture and personal beliefs, or through their just their mental library with the available species and animals that they're aware of. How much does this really affect what we're looking at and what's being given to us from these anecdotal reports? And there's a way of correlating, these little bits of shared details and making a composite of this creature.
Absolutely. And, there's so many of those elements that are so heavily correlated that, again, you should expect them. You should be able to predict them, that they occur. And very often those are the things that are used to dismiss the idea, very often when people think about human evolution, like the evolution of what we are today, they only go back as far as, certain ancestors. People look at, let's say, Australopithecus, and they think of 3.2 million years of evolution or whatever. And it's like, well, we are mammals and we are primates. And so we need to look more at 50, 60 million years of evolution. And that's kind of created what we are. And so one example that I point to often would be that, our smallest ancestors, the little rodent-sized primates that lived primarily in trees, they were hunted by mostly snakes, cats, and birds, all of which hunt by motion. And so the animals that remained motionless in the presence of those animals were selected for and survived. And so there's a conserved response, the freezing response, tonic immobility.
Okay.
Occurs very often. It's conserved across a lot of mammalia, certainly all primates and apes. And so one of the things that you see very often that people believe about Sasquatches is that they somehow have the power to incapacitate you. Whether that's through some people, it was previously thought to be like some sort of spiritual energy, or then thought to be like telepathy. And now they've couched that under the idea of infrasound, because infrasound is a real natural phenomenon. They use that as like an explanatory mechanism to describe the same effect. I think that sounds more kind of sciencey, and so people couch it under that. But it's like, well, what's really occurring here is that, you have this involuntary response. It's involuntary. You can't power it. And you look into the histories, again, of bears, tigers, and gorillas, all of which, across multiple cultures and contexts, thought that they had the ability to incapacitate a person with their gaze, that they could see you, that they could freeze you like stone, something of that nature. And so that's another example of like, well, you should expect people to experience that.
Yeah.
And based on the histories of these other animals, you should expect people to put the onus on the animal, because they don't understand that, like, no, this is a normative response within you that you're powerless to. Because again, if we're talking about millions of years of being prey animals, I mean, the mechanisms that selected for that, these involuntary automated mechanisms, like, they're way more sophisticated and selected for than your rational mind, than your reasoning.
It's like a bypass of your brain. It's a trip switch.
Certainly.
Exactly.
So we have this sort of newer portion of our brain, like, that creates reasoned thinking, rationality. We have, these abstract representations of potential motor outputs, on and on and on. But like, that's, much less sophisticated than this older host of biological responses, neurological responses. And so it's no wonder that people thought that this animal could do something to you that you were powerless against. And it's those very things that very often people will say, oh, well, this witness described being paralyzed by a Sasquatch at a distance. Hogwash, throw it out. And it's like, no, they're describing something that was experientially accurate or phenomenologically accurate. They just don't understand the mechanism. And so we should offer like more charitable takes. And so we just in general, like, interpreting testimonies is so difficult for that reason, because there's so many different factors that go into that. And it's easy to dismiss a lot of those things when they don't necessarily align with our presuppositions.
Oh, it's completely personal. It's completely subjective all the way.
Absolutely.
And I've noticed that with people. I got very interested for quite a long while in the psychosocial aspects of the genre, especially from a religious point of view, having somebody sort of with a religious background who married somebody from a different religious background, and observing the different way that we would both interpret the same event was very interesting to me, because we both had a religious slant that would go in a slightly different direction, not too different, but it was very clear to me that we experienced the same thing, and yet the interpretation was different. And that kind of made me kind of curious for a while. Applying it to this genre, I've met people who are completely on the paranormal side who say, no, because we can't find it, it must go into a portal. It must evaporate. It must have the ability to cloak. And my view on that personally, from a sort of a flesh and blood point of view, is, well, yes, but an animal that lives in the forest knows the forest as well as you know your neighborhood, and you know all the little ducks and the hides, the places where you can be out of sight, and that's also probably why it's very difficult to track them. Because I thought if somebody came into my house and moved one of the books, I'd come in and I'd feel something was off. Somebody's moved something in my house since it was last year. Maybe it's the same for these guys in the forest. Every leaf, every branch, every little tree with a, you know, a discrete camera on it with a camouflage pattern stands out a mile. And you know, we've all got these different perspectives, and I think that, you know, when we're looking at this creature, we can't but help look at it through those philosophical viewpoints, even ones that we might not practice anymore. You know, if you're Native American, you've grown up with that animistic, spiritual view where everything in the natural world is also part of the spiritual world, or, you know, you're a religious person who thinks that God created the world in 6 days and therefore these things will put you in overseer, or whatever the perspective you've got. It changes how you feel, and yet within that there is still the experience. You know, these how can I put it, these corresponding details that come out about the Bigfoot or Sasquatch and all the other different hairy humanoids around the world that interest me, that tells me that there is something to it, something more than, you know, personal beliefs and philosophies and religions and outlooks, and that's what I'm curious about. Now, you might be aware that recently I wrote another book about different sort of hairy, I didn't call it hominids, but humanoids, to be a bit more broad, around the world. And it got me thinking about the differences between some of these things. So Sasquatch, for example, or the skunk ape, or the Yerin, or the Almasti. Do you believe that we're looking at just one type of creature inhabiting these different parts of the world? Or do you think there might be many different subspecies, variants, if you will?
Oh, I definitely don't think they're the same thing. You know, let's say for the sake of argument that all those things are what people say that they are, you know, because again, we don't know that any of them exist.
No.
We believe, we're convinced, we're hopeful, et cetera, but we don't know in terms of, you know, we haven't demonstrated conclusively. But I just think based on not only physical descriptions, but physical evidence and the way that those things differ and can be fractionated out from each other, size, diet, behaviors that occur in certain contexts, that I mean, I really think that Ivan Sanderson's sort of model of there being these four different, you know, the neo giants, you know, which is very consistent across North America, parts of Eastern Asia, China, down through the Johor Peninsula of Malaysia into seemingly Australia with the Yowie. Those all generally describe something of the same build, stature, proportions. It exhibits the same behaviors in the same context. Their footprints are so highly similar that they must be, if not the same species, at least within the same genus. Then you have this more man-like form, you know, the Almas, the Almasti, the Barmanu, et cetera, where you're talking about the Hindu Kush over into Mongolia through Russia, the Caucasus, these other areas. And then, you know, I'm not necessarily super swayed or persuaded by the idea of a more quadrupedal ape-like form with a divergent hallux that Sanderson proposed that the Yeti or these other Himalayan, this ape form might be, because that evidence is so tenuous and there's so little of it. You know, there's the McNeely-Cronin footprints and then the Shipton footprints, which who knows that. I think Daniel C. Taylor made a really compelling argument that those are registered Tibetan snow bear tracks. I think it was Tibetan snow bear, some sort of Tibetan bear. But at least those three, and then the third category being the very diminutive, you know, orang pendek, you know, the Indonesian mystery hominoid that is a smaller stature. And so I don't think those could be from the same genus, although I could be wrong. But that's one of the things that's so fascinating, is that there are these differences and that they are so consistent across, you know, when you're talking about North America, you're not just talking about, you know, indigenous people or European settlers. Like there's this whole host of cultures that have influxed into the melting pot of North America, members of which all claim to see animals fitting this description. And it would be the same in Australia and these other places. And so I get, you know, as a big fan and reader of Carl Jung, People very often misunderstand what an archetype is or what an archetype was intended to describe, but it is often applied to like images and motifs or structural motifs. So I understand people's apprehension of like the wild man archetype, even though usually an archetype describes a series of behaviors that can be patterned, like, benevolent king or the tyrannical king or the trickster or the hero, on and on and on. They're not usually describing like an imagistic motif, like a symbol, but those things could be interchangeable. So I understand like the symbolic nature of the wild man. So of course there are commonalities, just like you could have the big cat archetype. Oh, well, people see the big cats, and it's like, well, tigers are not lions, are not jaguars, are not leopards, are not cheetahs, on and on and on. You can fractionate those things out, and like tigers don't occur in Africa, and on and on and on. So you could break those things down. And so I think a lot of people who are looking at the subject from that sort of global bird's eye view, they just see the category of wild man, and that's easy to dismiss the entire proposition that there might be biological species at play by saying, well, this is just the manifestation of this particular psychological element, or this part of the subconscious or the unconscious, or the wild man archetype. So of course there are commonalities across those things, but how interesting is it that what people claim to see in Asia for an extremely long time happens to coincide with like the fossils of this lineage of giant apes, and what people claim to see in Indonesia for untold passages of time happen to coincide with these smaller diminutive, Homo floresiensis, and on and on. Now, obviously, we have no record of primates, non-human, well, we have primates, but no non-human apes in the Americas. There are monkeys in South America and Central America, et cetera, but so we don't necessarily have that, or the same with Australia. There's no fossils of apes there, but just the fact that these things seem to be predictive in nature, but they really require sort of a microscope, because on a macro view, there is this wild man category that everything could sort of fit in. But again, like I would point to the big cat category. Like, of course, there's shared commonalities across.
I think that's a great explanation. In my mind, it was similar to that. Was with bears, essentially. Polar bear, black bear, grizzly, moon bear, sun bear. On and on and on.
Certainly.
All the way through. They are all distinctly and identifiably bears, and if you were familiar with one species, you would definitely identify another you'd never seen before as a bear. And yet they do have some incredibly divergent physiological differences, and especially in behavior and habitat as well, which is one of the things I try to point out about the wild man phenomenon worldwide to some people, and just say, well, look, even with the alleged sightings here in the UK, you would expect these animals to be adapted to this environment, to not have the habitat, the requirements of the North American Sasquatch, one we're most familiar with. And I think that's just something we're stuck on that, and that's a lot to do, I suppose, with the primacy of American culture, and where this particular genre is most popular. One would say, seems to dominate all things.
Well, it's definitely interesting to me. One of the arguments that people make for the archetype, because the proposition is like, this phenomenon exists, constituted of the body of claims and the physical items associated with the claims, touted as evidence, right? And so what's generating that? Well, there's either an animal that fits the descriptions in the claims and has feet shaped like the tracks associated with the claims, or in lieu of that, it has to all be the production of the human mind, because bears and elk and moose don't leave tracks like that, and most reasonable people wouldn't see a deer and conflate it with an 8.5 foot tall ape, on two legs. And so you're trying to get to the bottom of that. It's like biological animal production of the human mind. And so obviously the skeptical position would be that it's all the production of the human mind, and that could be two forms. Involuntary, something like an archetype that manifests itself, that's part of our the collective unconscious, part of the basically like the basal operating system of every human mind, or it's voluntary, which is fabrication, active imagination, and then offering something as true. It's probably a little bit of both going on. But the fact is that I think people that point to the archetypal argument say, well, look at it, it's a global phenomenon, which shows, and it's like, well, what's more interesting is where it's not occurring. Why isn't there a history of claims and evidence into modern times in the mountains of Korea, or in Fiji, or in the Carpathians, or in the Alps. There's plenty of forested habitat that would be viable that have other analogous animals. The Carpathians would be a great example with wolves and elk and brown bears and, a lot of the same animals that occur in other parts of Asia, America, where these things are seen. And yet there's no history that's comparable in terms of an unbroken timeline of claims and then people discovering what they interpret as evidence, whether those are tracks or capturing hearing vocalizations or seeing these things. And so you would think that if it were solely an archetype and part of this sort of collective unconscious from which such things emerge, that it should just happen wherever people occur. And it doesn't. It doesn't seem to. It occurs in Asia, down through Australia and North America primarily, and it makes sense in that regard. Now, obviously, there's African mystery hominoids too, which no one should be surprised by because actual hominoids emerged out of Africa and et cetera. So I find it just as compelling the places that constitute viable habitat that don't have a history of this phenomenon. To me,
especially when they're next door to neighbors or have a related history to cultures that did carry it forward. With the archetype, by the way, I was reminded oftentimes with lots of the woodwoes and woodwoes carvings in Britain and Europe, this hairy, large statured man carrying a club of the archetype of Hercules or Heracles, the Greek god, which would have been really, widespread through not only the Greek and Roman empires, but there's representations in the Babylonians and the Persians as well. So that really would cover a lot of ground in the old world. Also for things like the Basijan in the Basque country in Spain, they have an archetype that was very similar to Sylvanus, the shepherd god, and and so on and so forth. So I can see perhaps that's where we might have got some of our representations from, and in our noble tapestries from the 12th century in our cathedrals that still exist today. You can go around and visit them, and there they are. Some with conical heads, even constructed in the 12th century, before we really had any proper knowledge of apes. I think, wow, well, that's kind of curious. That's a very interesting feature, and yet, I still call back to that little get out of jail free card and say, wow, yeah, but there's that club again. There's old Hercules, making his appearance. And could we have perhaps either based or attributed the attributes to the hero Hercules to these wildmen types we were experiencing in the natural environment, or is he the source of them? And that's a curious thing to me. And then I wonder about the colonial outreach into the Americas. So even with things like the Pukwudgie, for example, and some other sort of North American little people or imp-type creatures, there's a real, and also in South America, with the Duende, there is a real correlation with some of the European myths of Pak and Apukra and all of these different things, and the Duendes. I wonder, was this first taken to them when we invaded them in the old times and then sort of inculcated in their cultures and fed back to us somehow at a later date? Maybe unknowingly, that it was brought into their culture. It was a way of relating whatever mysteries you had to the European colonizer, and then, like the pizza effect, pushed back out the other side and given his sacred writ, his ancient history. And that's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night, man.
Certainly, and all of those are fascinating things. You have to contend with those things to treat those subjects seriously. And so to me it's definitely the case that even if the biological animal exists, these other things are occurring. It's not like an either or proposition. Because, there are this socio-psychological phenomenon occurring too. There are, these involuntary sort of responses that might be interpreted as related to the Sasquatch. And then there are voluntary fabrications and imaginations, pathological, wishful thinking, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question to me is not just it's one nested inside of the other in all likelihood. But the real core of the question is like, is there an external, like empirical referent? Is there really this biological animal that's at the basis of all of this? And so, I mean, I'm fascinated by, we're talking about the Europeans making their way to North America, because again, we can date the oldest occurrences of like artistic representations of apes. There's no question, I think, among most of the people that have investigated that stuff, that they do represent some sort of hominoid. Now, the question is it supposed to be an exaggerated human, or, a human with these distorted features, or is this really based on apes, where in North America they should not have had any apes to observe, to base these observations on? So again, that's an interpretive game, and it's a bottomless pit, because we're still debating these things all these years later. But I just find it fascinating that, when you read a lot of the first written accounts, again, when the written word comes to North America and explorers, early scientists, people trying to describe plant and animal species, maybe let's say early what we would call like ethnographers, were there's always a dismissive element that, the famous, Elkanah Walker text with the Spokane tribe, which is later, I think that's 1840s, so it's not necessarily in the 1400s or 1500s, but even he says, bear with me if I trouble you with a bit of their superstitions. They believe in this race of hair-covered giants. And so there's always this dismissive element. I think it's Jose, I can't remember the name, it was a 1700s explorer who did a passage from essentially like the Bering Strait all the way down to Mexico, essentially. Jose Marcino, something of that nature. I'd have to pull it up.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So even he describes, these I think people on the Nootka Sound there in Vancouver Island, and there's always this dismissive element. And what's interesting is when you read those accounts, what people are describing, they're not like representative characters. Like Hercules is a representative. Zeus, Odin, etc. It's a character that has sort of like a moral foundation that provides information about how best to act in the world in certain contexts. Very often when you read the early ethnographers' accounts, what people are describing, what indigenous people are describing, is, living beings, like multiple beings that are associated with a place, a time, and some resource. We avoid this particular valley in the summer because that's when such and such is there collecting such and such food.
Okay.
So there's this whole environmental context. It's not just like, we that mountain because Odin lives there, like a singular figure that is ruler of thunder and lightning, whatever the case may be. They're very often describing what we would interpret as animals. I wish I had this quote pulled up. I hadn't been thinking about it, but I found this great quote from an individual. It'd probably take me too long to find it. That gorillas had the same associated history, and so very often the first Westerners dismissed the idea of gorillas because they had, again, some mystical or supernatural interpretations and elements. But when you look back at those oral traditions, they were talking about animals associated with specific places in certain contexts, seasonal contexts, food contexts. So to me, the idea that, obviously you had mandates that were issued that, the first explorers from Spain and other European countries were mandated to convert people they encountered to Christianity.
Yeah.
So it's like, we're going to supplant your belief system and convert you to this Western way of thinking. All of the early references I can find where indigenous people are describing these particular animals or things that are consistent with what we would call Sasquatch are always in the dismissive. And yet, very shortly thereafter, or concurrently, contemporaneously, Europeans are seeing these Wildmen, woolly boogers in the south, upon the discovery of the lowland gorilla, essentially Chayu in like the 1860s. Then they start describing American gorillas because they have a new nomenclature, a new name. And so it doesn't make sense to me that a group of people who would be so dismissive of the indigenous people would try to eradicate their way of belief and yet adopt this one particular thing and not all things. They're same things in the same environment. They're using different language for it, but I find that so compelling. And you don't even have until 1924, in the aftermath of the Ape Canyon event, a writer named, some people pronounce it Jorg, or some people pronounce it George, but it's Jorg, but he was essentially a Clallam Indian. he published a paper called The Real Americans, which was a paper for Native Americans, a publication for indigenous people. And in the aftermath of the miners and the ape attack at what is now Ape Canyon, he basically says what these folks are calling apes, or what we've been calling like Ceotics or Ceotics for all these years. So it's not until 1924 that someone says these two cultures are describing the same animals, and these are real animals, and here's what we know about them. And so it's hard for me to see it as like the European adoption of an indigenous folkloric element and then a reinvention and refeeding it back, just because it seems to be like this parallel unbroken timeline describing the same sorts of things in the same specific places and not describing it in the same places. There's no tradition of these things in vast open plains or high deserts where there's no trees.
It's also unlikely that the Europeans, as you say, would have taken on the legends with any seriousness of those peoples who they came to dominate. That's not a conquering cultural trait that people take on. Oh, by the way, why don't we adopt this into our folklore? So I completely agree with that. But about the gorilla thing, by the way, I mean, was it Hanno, the explorer in 500 BC, who went to, I think, what is now Sierra Leone or Ghana, one of those places in West Africa, and said he encountered a tribe of hairy women?
Hairy women, yeah. Right? That's what
it
was essentially meant,
Yeah, like these big hairy creatures. And even as recently as the lion killers, the billy apes, those chimps are huge. And they were ethno-known. And people were talking about them, and everybody was saying, no. These are tribal stories. There are no, 5-foot tall chimpanzees that live deep in the jungle that can attack and kill large animals that stand upright most of the time. And yet here we are, Billy Ape. It's in the, it's in the books of natural history now. Nobody even cares. And I often wondered that about cryptozoology. Is our mission essentially, once completed, something in which the kraken, the giant squid now is just another animal? The Bigfoot is there, stuffed in the history, the Museum of Natural History, and we've forgotten all about it. Is that the mission? Is that really what happens in life? It seems to be. We find these things, and I always wonder, with that in mind, if I want to find them for that very, or at least prove it for that very reason alone. But it's a wonderful thing. I'm interested in your take on, from an anecdotal point of view, on ethno-known animals. There have been so many, particularly discovered by cryptozoologists, but ethno-known creatures like the billy ape, like the okapi, and many other things. And there's a growing list of new animals that are discovered every single year. What do you think the likelihood of using anecdotal correlative reports and ethno-known tribal stories? What do you think the possibility of getting scientific classification at least penciled in on that basis alone is, even if just for the protection of species and habitat, based upon possibility of the animal's existence? Do you think that's something that could come about in the near future?
So, well, I think ethnozoology plays a huge role, and it probably took a long time for it to get to that. In order for people or scientists, whether we're talking about zoologists or biologists or whoever, to recognize the very real data that's contained in, whether we call it folklore, oral tradition, whatever. People unfortunately look at those as dismissive terms, but it's like there's still databases of knowledge. They just happen to be databases of like accrued experiences and observations that are accrued over time and then distilled into stories, because it's a lot easier to remember a story than it is like some bullet point list of facts. Yeah. And so people interact with the natural world. They have experiences. They encode those into stories, and then those change and get passed down over generations. And then as new experiences or observations that seem to be associated with that get incorporated into those stories. And so I think it was very easy for people to look at those as just myths or just, moral tales, because let's face it, like we're humans, our primary concern prior to, modern science is like, how do we act in the world? so that the world doesn't get us, so everything's a moral story. It's a lesson about how to behave in a certain context, whether that's, a relationship context with an emotional overtone, or whether that's how to behave in the face of, the dragon, the great unknown, the predatory creature, on and on. So I do think there are other pursuits that have now looked into the ethnozoology. Again, I got to try to find this quote, if I can find it quickly here, just because it was essentially a Canadian PhD describing the history of the gorilla and how these things were dismissed. And I will probably mispronounce his name because
that's okay.
It's Adam Peru Hermans Amir is PhD Director of Multimedia for the Tahltan Central Government of the Tahltan First Nation in Northern British Columbia, Canada. Talking about the way that Westerners treated Indigenous oral traditions about gorillas in Africa. So, quote, many Indigenous accounts of gorillas include magical or fairy tale aspects. The stories describe real occurrences while weaving these descriptive facts into a normative narrative akin to a fable or morality tale. This blend may have caused Western scholars aiming at scientifically accurate accounts of gorillas to be skeptical of the reliability of local stories. Instead of untangling the descriptive and normative elements, they dismiss the knowledge. Yeah. And so I think you see that, again, whether we're talking about the Sasquatch, but I'm sure, like we mentioned, there's that same sort of mystical interpretation of bears, tigers, gorillas, all these other animals that we're really fascinated with, that we accept to be real. And I don't know necessarily like the history of the okapi, but you just talked about, the billy ape. There's still probably some of those interpretations that people are all too ready to dismiss. Like, oh, chimpanzees, they're not going to nest on the ground like that. And they don't walk habitually upright or even, primarily upright, on and on and on. And so it's not, this is like, I've used this analogy a few times. I need to cook up a better one because it's kind of silly, I think. But you've seen The Sixth Sense, right?
Oh, yeah. The movie?
Yes. So it's like, spoiler alert for all your listeners if you haven't seen it. It's like 20-something years old now, so you should have seen it.
Yeah.
You watch this certain film, right? And you're watching this movie, this, version A, and then you find out at the end that Bruce Willis's character's been dead the whole time.
Yeah.
This twist ending. You can never watch version A again. Every time you watch it, you see the signal was there all along.
Yeah.
And I think this subject would be no different, and I'm sure it was the same for these other animals, in that right now we're in this dismissive phase, and should the Sasquatch be proven to exist, in retrospect, it will be blatantly obvious that the signal was all along, and that people will say, oh, well, look at these indigenous representations and the oral tradition, and look what the early European settlers said. And so I think there's a lot of that information, ethnozoographical information, that won't have value until discovery or recognition has occurred, which is frustrating. It's like you're flipping a coin and it's landing on its side every time, that you can't say like this.
Yeah, it's not one way or another. Why do you think, now, I know quite a few people engage in a few of the life sciences, and career-wise, I know that having the wrong opinions can be suicide, can be career suicide, professional suicide. But why do you think that is, especially in a discipline, in a genre that should really be so open to new possibilities, that it's actually very narrow? Why do you think that is? I mean, we know that new species are discovered every year. We have all these big signals, and with Bigfoot, for example, especially in North America and some other places like Australia and China specifically, you've got the footprints, for example. Great casts with dermal ridges and trackways that are almost, not always, as Cliff knows with the London tracks, but almost always very, very difficult to replicate, in such an authentic way. And yet, if that was some sort of new kind of deer or some new kind of bear that we were becoming aware of, and we had those level of tracks and hair and other types of things, that would be a huge signal to scientists and to naturalists and biologists. They'd be saying, we think there's a new kind of bear. In fact, we're going to say there is a new kind of bear based upon the footprints that we've collected, hundreds of examples, the examination of different hairs and other bits and pieces. Why can't we do that with Bigfoot, to use the catch-all term? Why do you think that is?
Oh man, it's there. I think there's such a host of reasons. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me is that we do seem to have a collective human blind spot about these. When I spoke with Gareth Patterson at length. He was a wildlife researcher, essentially worked with lions and then rediscovered a population of elephants, those most southerly elephants in Africa.
Oh, wow.
That the population had dwindled as such that most people were only seeing a single old female individual. They called her the matriarch, and it was assumed for a very long time that was the last of the southern elephants. And Gareth, with not quite single-handedly, but he definitely was the tip of the spearheaded this, rediscovered an entire population, and along the way saw these unknown hominoids upright.
Wow.
So
he saw them?
Oh yeah, he had 6 sightings over a period of 18 years of field research. He wrote a great book about it called Beyond the Secret Elephants. He wrote a book about the rediscovered the elephants called The Secret Elephants. Okay. And then in 2020 released a book called Beyond the Secret Elephants. I interviewed him on our podcast on Apes Among Us in April of 2020, and then Cliff and Bobo have had him on. He's a fascinating guy, but he's describing not only the indigenous people there and their he met many witnesses. He accumulated stories from other witnesses and direct witnesses, and they all had the same sort of blind spot. And then where he lives is a tourist town. It's called Neisna. It's right on the coast, like the very central coast, bottom of Africa. Seems like this idyllic place. I think the winters are like 68 degrees and the summers are in the low 80s. And so it's just this really beautiful coastal mountains and feinboss forest and then jungle forest. But anyway, so to talk to him about people's response to these things and how they're unwilling to, like people always wonder about cover-ups or suppressions. And it's like, yeah, there's a suppression and it's at the individual level. It's not some institutional level. It's like people who make contact with these things are just so unwilling to discuss it. And maybe that is because it's been stigmatized, but then you would think, well, where's the stigma of something like that in South Africa? Or I have a friend who's a carnivore biologist who worked in Southeast Asia for a long time. He accumulated a lot of, essentially like Yeren or Yeti stories from people and described the same phenomenon from those people in terms of like this mental resistance. I think it was Krantz. I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't remember the exact quote, but Krantz said, it's not the elusive Sasquatch that hides so well, but the human response that keeps them obscure. And so there's that element going on, I think, even in the minds of scientists, no matter how curious or interested they are. And we also have this problem, we run compression algorithms in our minds all the time to simplify the world into like some unidimensional analysis for everything. And it's almost always wrong because most things are paradoxical. It's just like, is it a biological animal or is it the production of the human mind? Well, it could be both occurring simultaneously, feeding each other, And so when it comes to people trying to understand something as complex as a person, I mean, you probably see this. I deal with this all the time. It happens in the U.S., let's say, with whether it's political divides or other divides on social issues, that just to bridge the gap and have a conversation is seen as a tacit endorsement of the entirety of the other person's view. I get asked to speak. I get asked to speak about the subject, and it might be a paranormal podcast. Or it might be at a conference where most of the speakers think that Sasquatches are like interdimensional or UFO riding, shape-shifting aliens. And so my perspective is always like, they're going to have this conference with or without me. Someone is going to speak in that spot. Now, if I'm there, I can offer my perspective, which is hopefully a grounded biological, ecological perspective that's also charitable to those interpretations, saying, I understand why people think this. Here's how these could be real biological animals and still people interpret them that way. And I can't tell you how many people will be like, oh, well, so you're a paranormal guy now because you're speaking. No, I'm not. I'm offering my perspective. And so there's this, I think, in the science,
the world is, go on,
that to entertain or to bridge the gap with the Sasquatch, it's probably seen the same way as like, it's seen as like a tacit endorsement of all the claims and all the evidence.
I think that's a good explanation.
And so it's better to not touch it at all because, we're all discriminating. We're trying to say, like, here's this body of evidence. And we could call it cherry picking, but it kind of is. I mean, everything's cherry picking, really. You're trying to pull good data. You're trying to pull signal from noise. Is that cherry picking? Probably, but how else are we going to?
Well, yeah, sure, but I mean, the same happens in regular science when they're looking for information. If that's the data they have to work with, that's what they work with.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a normal thing. I remember, and I definitely, I've experienced this with a lot of witnesses with Bigfoot more than anything else, that they are reticent to put their name to it. Like if I interview somebody who thinks they've seen Nessie, it's almost like a badge of honor. You know, they'll say, I saw Nessie. And I'll say, oh, really? Tell me about your Nessie sighting. They're really excited. And because it has a sort of a fun, tabloid newspapery badge of, yes, great, I came to Loch Ness and I saw Nessie, sort of feel about it. But with Bigfoot, nothing good happens to you when you report a Bigfoot sighting. You don't get that promotion you're after the next year because you went public with your Bigfoot sighting. They think, actually, no, not Matt. He believes in Bigfoot. And let's look at this other guy. And there's no rewards for it. I remember the one time I met Jeff Meldrum, him saying that he was lucky that he had tenure already when he came out and started studying Bigfoot, because they tried to get rid of him. Faculty tried to get rid of him. And that's like, wow, it's just a genre. It's just an idea, even from that perspective. And he is an anthropologist. It seems to fit perfectly with his mode of study. And also I forget what the name for that particular science is, but the studying the morphology of feet, that speciality within that as well. I know there's a word for that. And I thought, wow, this is really something. And as you dig in more and more, and I work in healthcare now, I have done for the last 12 years, and you realize, you meet doctors, you meet researchers and specialists, and there's certain areas where you just are not allowed to go into. If you do, you better be established already, or you better have something that's going to work out really quickly with your experiment or your science, and that people will want, because if it's not that, you're going to be canned and you'll never get back in. And that's interesting to me. I'm also then conflicted seeing the way that we're left with just us crypto guys, citizen scientists, to make these discoveries. And so far in the world of animal discovery, I don't know one that has been discovered by a cryptozoologist. I think that, in fact, there was a new slug in Europe discovered recently by citizen scientists. That's the list. I think that's the entire list.
Yeah.
And what are we going to do if we can't get these guys on board in a significant way, in a realistic way? We need the scientific community to come on board and do that work. If it is a real animal, and if it is something that's outside of culture and superstition and myth and folklore, then we need them, especially with the things people talk about in the world about ecology and environments crumbling and being destroyed. They may be gone by the time we've even had a chance to look for them.
I think there's a twofold problem there. There is the problem of whether we say science or academia having a difficult time looking at it, but there's also the problem of the proponents and what they offer as evidence, because there is sort of a rule set in place, a standard of evidence that a lot of people are not willing to play by those rules.
Yeah.
So I've definitely seen on the scientific side or the academic side or the skeptical side, whatever, the two sides of the divide, that circular thinking of would you take a look at this? We think it might be associated with the Sasquatch. Oh, well, it can't be because there is no Sasquatch.
Yeah.
Well, what would convince you that there is? Oh, I'd need to see evidence. Well, what about this? Well, that can't be evidence because there is no Sasquatch.
Yeah.
That there might be. Oh, I'd need to see evidence. Well, what about this? Oh, that can't be evidence.
Yeah, I've experienced
but
that.
Again, the other side of that coin is what is being held up as evidence.
Yeah,
It does require a lens, like Jeff Meldrum or Grover Krantz or these certain science anatomists, anthropologists, biologists who have the right interpretive schema to look at those forms of evidence and analyze it and offer their opinions, are not going to translate to, a microbiologist who studies, bacteria or whatever, or not going to translate to, a chemist, on and on and on. So there are these people in their relevant disciplines that can see certain evidence through the right lenses, but in terms of the overarching structure, let's say the establishment or whatever people want to call it. It's like, well, no, the standard would be a body or a diagnostic portion of a specimen, and no one's willing to play that game. And so it's like you're right.
That.
You know,
Yeah.
In the void of scientific involvement, the void gets filled by amateurs. You know, I'm an amateur like most of us. I have no business. You know, I don't have a degree. I grew up playing music. Still play music. You know, like these other passions. You know, I'm autodidactic in terms of I read a lot about biology, anthropology, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, there's a lot of people who should be looking into this other than me, you know, based on their qualifications and their disciplines. But I also understand that, like, well, if I wanted to sway those people, there's a certain category of evidence I would need. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily, they want to play the game, but they don't want to play by the rules.
Yeah.
You know, I always had this commitment to, you know, if you look at categories of evidence, like the best pieces of visual evidence, which are still not proof, they're hotly debated. The Patterson film, on and on. The best footprint data, still not proof, hotly debated, hoaxed, real, etc. On and on. It's like, well, if you look at the detail, the resolution, you know, the clarity, the quality, let's say, like a qualitative distinction of the best in its category, photographs, tracks, vocalization, recordings, on and on and on. It's like, well, if what I find or collect isn't as good or better than that, then there's no point in trying to offer it publicly or defend it, because if these best in their category thus far haven't done it, how should I define my expectations that anything of lesser quality would have any impact? Now, within my circles, you know, because we've created our own little Bigfoot value structure where we ooh and ah over, you know, certain bits of tantalizing evidence, but I should have no expectation that I could take it out of that circle into academia or science and that they would do anything other than laugh. And so it is this twofold thing. Like it's easy for proponents to lay all the blame at like science won't pay attention to us, but they're also not, you know, that's like science is playing basketball and proponents are showing up with baseball bats. And it's like, you're playing the wrong, you're not.
And they're actually very clear about what they expect as a form of evidence. And it's not like we don't know that. And I think that's where the believing comes into play sometimes for people. And maybe when you believe something, there's a faith aspect to that expects that other people will feel the faith that you feel when you express, you know, this passion that you have. That's something I'm familiar with. And I think it's why should we expect that from them? I started as a real firm believer, as somebody who wanted to prove the genre, and with all cryptids. And I've actually come to this position now where I think it's not right for me to believe it. It's not right for me to believe it because then I'm putting a sort of a faith aspect into the game. Until it's proven, I don't have that right. So if a witness gives me a report, I believe the witness at point. Those are the rules. Maybe there might be some red flags about the sighting. That means I can't use it, but I thank you for your sighting. I believe you. That's great. Thanks for showing trust in me. However, from an evidential point of view, I'm like, no, I don't believe any of this anymore until it comes to that point where it can be evidenced in a scientific way. And up until that point, you know, I'm a hopeful skeptic, somebody who dreamlike, you know, wants to see these wonderful explorations and adventures give fruit. You know, I believe that all of those animals we discovered in the 19th century and thereon, that wasn't the end of it. You know, we just lost interest. It's time to get back out there and find them again.
Oh yeah, well, I think that's a great point. You know, one of the things I've said for years, and a lot of my closest researcher friends get so offended at this, so I'm going to aim this at them because you know, it is often painted as like this battle between evidence and belief, but we're all believers in various things, and it is faith all the way down. Now you could substitute the word faith for trust, but I think faith digs the knife a little more, and so I tend to use that one. But with anything, I mean, think of all the things that we take for, you know, we all have dogmas, all of us, you know, like this accepted set of facts that we then build upon. It's like, well, we could look at all the sciences and go like, well, have you run those experiences and observed them? No, do you have faith or trust in the validity of those? I mean, our whole world is structured that way. You know, I don't think too deeply about how my phone was designed. I trust that it works. It gives me the feedback I want, etc. But when it comes to the Sasquatch thing, like it's along those same lines in that, well, you know, if you're dealing with witnesses, let's say, and you do your own investigation into their character and it seems to be unimpeachable, well, you're having faith in your own investigative skills, you're having faith in the validity of what you find, you have faith in your ability to detect truth from lies. Even when it comes to evidence, it's like, well, I'm using my trust of the interpretive skills of a Krantz, a Bindernagel, a Meldrum, you know, other scientists. And so it's like, I'm not an anatomist. You know, I've read as much as I can to have, like, again, like sort of an autodidactic grasp, but it could be a very loose grasp because I don't know what I don't know. And so I could have many errors in my thinking and undoubtedly many gaps in my thinking. So it's all these levels of faith, like, no, this evidence, we have evidence. Yeah, but it's like you're relying on, you're trusting this person's expertise and their analysis. Also, like with any given track, you know, you can say, look how beautiful this is. Oh my God, oh, it's amazing. It was found in the middle of nowhere. It's like, was it? Do you know that? Were you there? So you have faith that this person who collected this evidence found it where they said they found it, in the context where they said they found it, and didn't sculpt it over a week in, you know, a sandbox.
Stick signs, for example. Yeah, stick signs.
I mean, people always think about fake tracks in terms of stompers that someone put on stompers, and it's like, why couldn't someone just build a dirt box in their kitchen and labor over it for weeks and make the perfect? So, but when someone says this track was found in blah 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 in 1982, on and on, it's like, well, we're trusting that. And so I think it's okay to admit that. What I see a lot of proponents doing is, I'm not a believer. I don't play in the realm of belief. I'm a scientist. It's like, no, we are all believers. We're all subjective. We are subjects. We're not objects. The normative way of human thinking is subjective. Magical thinking is the normative way of human thinking. That's why it's prevalent around the world. Science is so new. If we weren't magical thinkers, we wouldn't need science. We would just think that way anyway. And we wouldn't have to create a process and a method to figure things out and strip away the subjective to find out what's left. And so I think more people should be willing to just accept that and admit that like, you'll never find a human, there's no human being immune to confirmation bias. None, you know?
Oh no, I mean, that's, I think it was a disclaimer in the foreword that I wrote to introduction to one of my books. It was, to the best of my ability, you know, hopelessly so, I've tried to escape my confirmation bias, but, you know, the actual process of trying to do that is impossible. Everybody knows that. I know what my biases are, and just knowing them perhaps can help you.
Absolutely.
You never escape from them. No, I think it's, you know, it's an interesting thing, and there is something to it. I think there is something very, very significant to this phenomenon, for sure. Absolutely. I've met too many people who've had terrifying experiences, actually, for some of them that they can't unsee, and for many of them they had no skin in the game previously. And that says something to me, that at least whatever it is they're seeing was significant enough to, you know, to change the outlook of their life, philosophically at least, about the way the world is and what it's comprised of. So that's an interesting thing. Matt, I think we should wrap up here. But what's your view? What's the way forward for Sasquatch research? What do you think are the major components to get some success in this realm?
Certainly. Well, again, I think that acknowledgement of belief, faith, or trust, etc., is important because, you know, do I believe Sasquatches are real flesh and blood animals? I do. Like, I'm convinced. But it shouldn't matter what I believe. It should matter what I can demonstrate. And so I have to not devote too much energy into trying to promote, you know, like in a conversation, people also like convince me. It's like, well, I can convince you that the pursuit is valid, that the phenomenon exists because the claims exist and the physical items exist. Now, I can't demonstrate what causes them. Whether it's solely psychological or where there is an animal. So you could have a conversation that convinces people that the pursuit is actually valid and or necessary and the benefits that would come from answering that particular question. But, you know, I think what what many people want, or whether they explicitly state it or it's implicit in their actions and behaviors, they want it to be validated or recognized. And again, they're totally unwilling to play by the rules of science, which is fine, because if you just want to satisfy your own curiosity, great, because you get to determine, you get to set the bar. For you, to the individual who wants to satisfy their own curiosity, if you want to think that every divot in the ground is a Sasquatch track, knock yourself out, and you will satisfy that curiosity, and you'll come away with this knowledge. The second that you want to prove it to other people, like I want to convince my friend here that these things are real. Well, now you're playing by their standard. To them, a divot in the ground might not be a track. That's just a divot in the ground. What are you talking about? And so when it comes to science or the establishment or academia or whatever, whatever the man, as people see it, this big looming thing, it's almost like they treat it like this big massive idol, this big deity that's like, please notice me, but they're not willing to play by its rules. They want to be validated by science. They want to be looked at as scientists. And yet when science says, here's what we require, people go, not going to do it. You should accept. It's kind of like, someone saying,
because I know, I've seen it. I know you should accept what I'm saying. I know. Exactly. Are you saying I'm lying?
So I think the path forward for people is like, anyone who's involved in this should realistically define their expectations. Like I said, you want to prove it to yourself, you want to prove it to other people, you want to prove it to the world. Because defining your expectation, you have to conduct yourself a certain way. That determines, like, well, what are you going to do? So if you're trying to, film or photograph one, it's like, well, you have to synthesize all these observations of people who claim to see one and try to replicate those in some way that would allow you to film or photograph one. And, if you fail to do that, then, there's so many people that go out and, maybe they're wearing bright colors and smoking a pack of cigarettes and making a bunch of noise and sitting out in the woods and hacking and coughing and, well, I didn't see no Bigfoot, they must not be here. It's like, well, maybe you failed to conduct the experiment correctly. If I was hunting, trying to get photographs of tigers, I would probably have to be concealed and camouflaged and be in place for a long time to have that once in a lifetime rare sighting and get a photograph. And so I think that the problem that I see is that proponents don't thoroughly define their expectations and don't conduct themselves according to their stated expectations.
Okay.
I want to prove it's real. Well, you're not going to do that from casting more tracks or red circles on photographs of shadow or, another recording of some distant howl that's barely audible. It's like we've got to move past that. But I understand that what they're really doing is try to satisfy their own curiosity, but present it in a way that they think will make the deity of the establishment smile upon them favorably.
It's almost kudos like as well, I think, in the community. Oh, what a great recording, what a great clip, what a great red circle. Those seem to get the most hits out of everything, actually, those red circles. I once posted a picture. I just stood on one side of the river near my house. I photographed a bunch of trees at the other side, and I said, in this picture, I posted it on some website, I can't remember, some page, 2 dogmen and a juvenile Bigfoot on the right, and put the circles there. Everybody was like, wow, amazing. Oh, awesome pic. Yeah, keep up the good work. I was like, wow. Absolutely wow. That's insane. There's clearly nothing here. And yet that gets me the most hits I get out of anything.
That's wild. I mean, that's what we do. We look at the night sky and we see gods and bears and, the constellations, and we make sense out of noise. And so it's like, I understand why people do that. They live in a more exciting world than I do, because I just see shadows. And I'm like,
I'd love to be that positive, even, and hopeful. That would be fantastic, and I think that's that's one of the great things. But once again, as you pointed out, it depends what the reasons are for people's interest in the genre. If they're philosophical, if they're spiritual. I often thought there was the lack of corporate religion in our societies in the West these days might actually have left many gaps. And when I was looking at the little people in one of my books, all of these fairy farms and fairy whisperers and tours that are springing up all over the place, and these great channels that are very ASMR calming. There was a British guy who ran an amazing one with clearly, CGI fairies in it. that Erwin Sanders, I think his name was, people loved it. They loved him. They loved the channel. They believed it because they liked him. They wanted that experience to happen. And yet, I'm walking up to like tiny little houses on some farm in Ireland somewhere for paying a couple of £100 for the pleasure to be told that fairies live there and getting something out of it. And I think that's where we are. Corporate religion has collapsed, and we're trying to fill that void, because there is a void, that says, explain stuff, give my life meaning. Sometimes the Sasquatch fills that void as well for some people, I think.
I think anything does, but this for sure, because, like the proponents sort of have the pursuit is rested upon like a particular fantasy, myth, whatever you want to call it, a narrative about like the discovery of these animals, if real, will make the world a better place. We'll give protection to them. We'll validate eyewitnesses. We'll validate the maverick scientists who stood at the vanguard and were laughed at, on and on. And so it's sort of like this, there's a bit of myth making there that like this will have some deeper meaning for the greater good of humanity and the Sasquatch, the animals, the planet, etc. I think skeptics are embedded in the same pursuit of meaning, like eradicating this particular variant of pseudoscience will be a victory for the truth, and we will eliminate the snake oil salesman and the con men and the cult of bigfootery. And so they're still, both are like, whether they make it explicit or not, I think both sides think that they're engaged in a moral pursuit that's all for like the greater good. So they just have different variations of what the greater good is. And so
that's very interesting.
Have any pursuit without somewhere it being nested with inside like a moral, like it's an ethical pursuit, and people just don't acknowledge that. They say no, it's an entirely an intellectual.
It's hardwired. That explains actually sometimes some of the skeptic explanations I've heard, which are even more far out than the what's being proposed. There's one for Nessie, for example, that was proposed by a well-known skeptic. Two very crazy ones. One was that Nessie is a giant mud skipper with a plesiosaur like head and neck as a lure. It's a lure to attract prey. And my question was, how big are the fish it's trying to attract?
Yeah.
This thing is 40 feet long. And the other one was Ghosts of Dinosaurs, written by a very, very good author. That's the people are seeing ghosts, replays of dinosaurs from the old days. And I thought, wow. And that got such a big thumbs up, as opposed to some escapee from a prehistoric era that could be living on into our times. That was mad. But the ghost thing, that was A-okay. I thought, wow, like literally, sometimes the skeptic explanation is much further away from any plausibility than, what we're proposing on this side. And I think we should leave it there. I do want people to find you, though. So if people want to get involved in your work, or they want to find out what you're up to, where can they go?
Certainly. Well, I'm a member of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, so you could find them at woodape.org. There's a lot of good information there. I produce and edit Cliff and Bobo's podcast, Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo, which is a lot of fun. So I'm hopefully people enjoy that and check it out. And then if you wanted to reach out to me, you can find me online at mattpruittonline.com.
Awesome. Matt, it's been a wonderful chat. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I really, really appreciate it.
Take care.